What if the woman who never apologized was the only one who truly saw him? And what if the man who had everything found himself undone by silence? Helen Ward wasn't born to impress. She was born to observe, design, build, disappear. Until the night she spilled red wine on the shirt of billionaire Jonathan Reed and didn't flinch, didn't panic, didn't even apologize. He expected entitlement. She gave him indifference. He was used to admiration. She gave him a mirror. Jonathan had spent years behind boardroom walls, groomed to be unreadable, powerful, untouchable. But Helen, she didn't chase him. She didn't fear him. And that made her unforgettable. What happens when the most silent woman becomes the loudest echo in your life? And what if love doesn't begin with passion, but with presence? This isn't a story of wealth. It's a story of timing, tension, and the quiet pull between two people who've mastered solitude until they meet someone who makes them question it all. Can the ones who never ask for love still be worthy of it? Like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more tales that whisper, linger, and leave you different than before. Now, let's begin. The ballroom was glowing. Golden lights shimmered off the tall crystal vases, each filled with white lilies. Soft jazz music echoed through the marble-floored hotel lobby, and the scent of champagne and fresh citrus wafted in the air. It was the kind of night designed for people who wore success like perfume loud, expensive, and invisible until they walked past you. Helen Ward didn't belong there. Not in her mind. Anyway. She adjusted the black strap of her work tote, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and stepped into the room with quiet confidence. Her blazer was simple, her heels scuffed at the back. She wasn't dressed to impress, but to disappear. She hated these things, these networking events disguised as celebrations. Tonight was the groundbreaking gala for the Greenway Urban Park Project, a new city initiative funded by a private investor. Helen was the lead urban designer, the mind behind the sketches, the one who had mapped every bench and walking path. But no one was here for the planner. They were here for the money. She hadn't even planned to stay long. Drop in, say a few words, leave quietly before the handshakes and fake laughs started. Helen reached for a glass of wine from the passing tray. The waiter nodded politely, and she muttered a thank you without looking. Then she turned and collided hard into a man's chest. Red wine, white shirt, a gasp from a nearby guest. Helen blinked twice. Her glass had tipped completely. The deep burgundy soaked through crisp cotton, bleeding into fabric that probably cost more than her entire week's grocery budget. Damn, he muttered, more surprised than angry. I guess I owe you a dry cleaning bill, Helen said calmly, barely blinking. The man looked down at his stained shirt, then up at her. He was tall, well-groomed, sharp jawline, late 40s, maybe. The kind of face you'd expect to see in Forbes, not in a minor city event. She braced herself for arrogance, or worse, pity. But he just stared at her, not in annoyance, not in shock, in curiosity. You're not going to apologize, he asked finally. A small lift to his brow. Helen tilted her head, voice steady. You're not bleeding. You'll survive. And with that, she walked past him. No flushed cheeks, no nervous laugh, no glance back. Jonathan Reed, billionaire investor and guest of honor, was left standing there, wine dripping from his chest, watching a woman in flats and minimal makeup vanish into the crowd like smoke. He hadn't expected that, not the spill, not the silence, and certainly not the look in her eyes. She hadn't recognized him, or worse, she had, and didn't care. Helen stood at the far end of the room, near a window. The city stretched out beyond the glass in glittering silence. She exhaled slowly, calming the small adrenaline rush in her chest. She hadn't meant to spill the wine, but she wasn't going to melt into apologies either. Apologies rarely meant anything in rooms like this, and men like him were used to being tiptoed around. She took a sip from a second glass, her lips barely touching the rim. She didn't drink much, not anymore. Alcohol dulled the senses, and Helen liked her edges sharp. Too many nights of pretending to laugh at bad jokes had taught her the value of silence. From across the room, she felt at the weight of his gaze, He hadn't forgotten. Of course not. Helen had learned to feel eyes on her without looking. It came with being a woman in boardrooms full of voices that grew louder when hers stayed quiet. "Is that the woman who spilled on Mr. Reed?" someone whispered. "She didn't even say sorry. Do you think she's someone important? I heard she's the one behind the park project." Helen ignored it all. This wasn't her first room full of noise. Later that night, she slipped away from the crowd and into the hallway leading to the exit. The heels of other guests echoed behind her, fading with distance. She didn't expect to hear his voice. "Do you always exit without a word?" Helen paused but didn't turn. "I prefer not to linger where I'm misunderstood." Jonathan chuckled, low and warm. "I wasn't misunderstanding. I was impressed." She finally turned, her expression unreadable. "Why?" "Because I didn't apologize." "No, because you didn't flinch." She studied him carefully. He had changed his shirt charcoal gray now, sharp and elegant. But it wasn't his suit that caught her attention. It was the look in his eyes, not flirtation, not amusement, genuine interest. "You're not used to that, are you?" she asked. "To people not flinching, to people treating you like everyone else." There was a pause, long, honest. "No," he said softly. Helen nodded once. "Then maybe it's time you got used to it." And again. She walked away, leaving behind a man who had always had the last word until now. Jonathan Reed had built an empire on his ability to read a room. In boardrooms, he could anticipate a rival's hesitation before the words ever left their lips. At galas, he noticed every glance, every calculation behind a glass raised in toast. In interviews, he answered questions that hadn't even been asked yet. He was a master of language, spoken and unspoken. But that night, standing in a ballroom, surrounded by polished smiles and empty flattery, he found himself thinking about a woman who had barely said a word. Helen Ward. She didn't ask for his name. She didn't apologize for the wine. She didn't shrink under his gaze or make excuses to keep talking. She didn't seem interested in anything he represented. And yet, he couldn't forget the look in her eyes. Not cold, not cruel, just quiet and sure. Jonathan had grown immune to attention. People were always watching him for the wrong reasons. Some for approval, some for opportunity, some just to say they had met him. But Helen hadn't looked at him like a billionaire. She had looked at him like a man in a wet shirt. And somehow, that was more disarming than any flirtation. The next morning, Jonathan stood in the private lounge of his high-rise, sipping black coffee that had gone lukewarm. His assistant, Greg, was rambling off calendar items for the day: an investment call, a donor breakfast, and the usual oversight meetings for the Greenway Urban Park project. "Did you get a chance to meet the design lead last night?" Greg asked between notes. "The city's been raving about her." Jonathan's gaze drifted to the city skyline. "Helen Ward," he said quietly. Greg blinked. "Right. That's her." You met Jonathan didn't answer. He just sipped the coffee he no longer tasted. Later that afternoon, he requested the project files again, not the financials this time, but the planning documents, the sketches, the handwritten notes in the margins. He sat alone in his office, studying them as if they could tell him more about the woman behind them. There was no flourish in the drawings. Everything had purpose. Benches placed beneath shade trees for mothers who waited, paths wide enough for wheelchair turns, a layout that welcomed stillness, not spectacle. It wasn't just design, it was empathy. And it made sense now why Helen had walked away from him so effortlessly. She wasn't avoiding attention. She was used to being overlooked, and perhaps preferred it that way. That realization hit him harder than he expected. Jonathan couldn't remember the last time someone challenged him without raising their voice. Helen's silence wasn't emptiness, it was presence, and it lingered, even 2 days later, as he sat in a meeting discussing soil conditions and zoning permits. Her voice, calm and unapologetic, echoed in his memory. "You'll survive." A simple phrase, not unkind, just honest. He had survived far worse, but he wasn't sure if he'd ever been quite so seen. That evening, Jonathan didn't return home right away. Instead, he drove. No destination, just miles. The city blurred by as he passed familiar streets, each one brimming with noise, neon, and ambition. But all he could think about was how quiet Helen had made everything feel like pressing pause in a world that never stopped spinning. He wasn't a man easily intrigued, but Helen Ward wasn't a woman easy to forget. Back in her small apartment, Helen sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through sketches for an upcoming presentation. Her radio played soft classical music in the background. A candle flickered beside a worn book of poetry. She had almost forgotten the incident from the gala. Almost. But every now and then, she would feel a small wave of something unnameable wash over her. Not regret, not attraction, just curiosity. Jonathan Reed wasn't just another wealthy man. She had Googled him later. Of course. Who wouldn't? He was predictably powerful, predictably successful. But there were whispers too. Stories of calculated ambition, of boardroom takeovers, of a broken engagement that made headlines once upon a time. She wondered what he saw in a woman like her. Then again, maybe he hadn't seen anything at all. And that, strangely, was comforting. Jonathan sat alone that night on his balcony. The city glowed beneath him, vast and indifferent. He had spent his life climbing towers, building them, buying them, watching others fall from them. But in the space of a few seconds, he had been brought back down to earth by a woman with ink-stained fingers and no tolerance for ego. It wasn't attraction that haunted him. It was recognition. Because if Helen Ward wasn't trying to impress anyone, then maybe, deep down, neither was he. There were two types of power. The first kind walked into a room and announced itself. Loud suits, louder voices. Names dropped like grenades. Jonathan Reed had seen that power worn by men who built their reputations like billboards, bold, visible, and hollow. Then there was the second kind, the kind that didn't need to speak to be heard. The kind that looked you in the eye and made you forget what you were about to say. The kind you couldn't fake, because it came from scars no one saw. Jonathan had spent years becoming that second kind. But tonight, sitting alone in his penthouse study, tie loosened and collar open, he felt like a boy again. The boy who used to press his ear to his parents' closed door, hoping to hear anything that sounded like love. It never came. His father, Charles Reed, had been a brilliant man. Brilliant and brutal. He believed emotions were for the weak, and discipline was the only inheritance worth leaving behind. His mother, elegant and absent, floated through rooms like a ghost in silk. Her approval came in glances, never words. By age 15, Jonathan had learned 3 things. Vulnerability was dangerous. 2, silence was strategy. 3, love, if it existed, came with conditions. So, he built walls, not with bricks, but with degrees, deals, and dividends. By 32, he had bought his first company. By 35, he was on magazine covers. By 40, he had been engaged and left. No explanation. Just a note. I can't love someone who never lets me in. That part still stung. Not because he missed her, but because she wasn't wrong. He had learned to curate his life the way others curated wine lists, sharp, precise, and always palatable to the audience. His charm was practiced, his schedule airtight, his heart off limits. Until now. Until Helen Ward. Jonathan leaned back in the leather chair, the city lights casting faint shadows against the ceiling. He remembered the way she had looked at him, not with admiration, not with judgment, but with something far more dangerous indifference. It wasn't rejection, it was something else entirely, like she had seen the man beneath the mask and found nothing remarkable. And that unsettled him, because for all his control, all his calculated poise, there was still a boy inside him who wondered, if I take the mask off, would anyone stay 2 days later? He found himself at City Hall, sitting in a conference room waiting for the design team to arrive. His company was finalizing the last phase of funding for the Greenway Urban Park. It was standard. He didn't need to be there, but he had insisted. Greg had raised an eyebrow. You're attending the design review personally. Jonathan nodded, just curious to see it through. Helen entered the room exactly on time, not a second early, not a second late. Her presence was unassuming, but there was something grounded in her movement, like a tree that didn't sway. even when the wind insisted. She wore no jewelry. Her notebook was leather-bound, corners worn. She didn't greet him with anything beyond a nod. No small talk, no pretenses. It was both refreshing and disarming. Jonathan had prepared himself for charm, for wit, for the kind of performance he gave others. But Helen offered nothing except her work, and her work was beautiful. As she walked through the presentation, pointing out the restorative value of shaded paths, the child-safe layout of the playground, the preserved trees saved from demolition, Jonathan felt something stir in him he hadn't felt in years. Pride, not in her, in the possibility of building something that mattered. After the meeting, most people filed out. Helen stayed behind, gathering her papers without urgency. Jonathan hesitated. Then, "You speak differently when you talk about your work." She glanced up, surprised. "How so? Like you forget there's anyone watching?" Helen considered that for a moment, then gave a small shrug. "That's when I'm most myself." He nodded slowly. "It suits you." She raised an eyebrow. "Being myself?" "No, not needing approval to be." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just full of everything they weren't saying. Then Helen picked up her folder, nodded once, and walked out. Jonathan watched her go, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like chasing. He just wanted to understand. That night, he didn't go to another meeting, didn't reply to messages. Instead, he stood at the window, watching the city hum below. He thought of the parks from his childhood, the ones he was never allowed to run in because his father thought scraped knees were distractions. He thought of Helen's sketch of a bench placed under a flowering tree, surrounded by silence. And he wondered, could someone like him ever belong in that kind of quiet, not as a donor, not as a CEO, just as a man? Helen didn't believe in fate, but she believed in irony. That Monday morning, she stepped into the meeting room on the 14th floor of city planning like she had done a dozen times before. Her notepad was tucked neatly under one arm, a pencil behind her ear. She wore her usual gray slacks and navy blouse, crisp, functional, no nonsense. What she didn't expect was to find Jonathan Reed already seated at the table, alone, in her seat. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable, somewhere between polite surprise and something more calculating. "Morning," he said, as casually as if they shared coffee breaks. Helen blinked once. "You're early. You're on time," he replied, then gestured to the chair across from him. "I suppose we meet in the middle." She sat, slowly, cautiously. Everything in her tightened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, flipping open her notepad but not writing a word. "I'm now the city's appointed co-strategic partner on Greenway." He didn't blink, "Which means I'll be reviewing planning updates directly with your team. And with you." Helen's pencil stilled. "You're on the development committee I asked to be." Why? Jonathan folded his hands, leaning back slightly. "Because I don't like signing checks for things I don't understand." Helen gave a short, dry breath that might have been mistaken for a laugh. "You're here to monitor us. I'm here to contribute," he said, evenly. "And perhaps to learn." She studied him, trying to detect sarcasm, but there wasn't any. He meant it. And for some reason, that was more unnerving than if he hadn't. Their first joint meeting was a disaster waiting to happen. The room was packed with city officials, landscape consultants, and stakeholders who were visibly surprised and mildly amused to see the elusive CEO in a room full of environmental planning charts. Helen presented first. She kept her tone calm and measured, pointing out key updates on zoning approvals and community feedback from local residents. Jonathan waited until she finished before interjecting. "I noticed the east walking path curves away from the existing shade line. Any reason we're not preserving more tree cover heads turned?" Helen lifted her chin, gaze steady. "Because the ground there has a grade drop. Wheelchair access would require more excavation than the budget allows." Jonathan nodded. "I see. And if I adjusted the budget..." She narrowed her eyes. "Then I'd ask why we're suddenly making compromises for aesthetics over accessibility." The room went quiet, but Jonathan didn't flinch. "I wasn't suggesting a compromise. I was offering options." Helen held his gaze. She had faced plenty of men who talked over her, but very few who pushed back without pushing through her. This was different. After the meeting, she packed her things quickly, hoping to avoid the small talk she hated most, the kind laced with curiosity, disguised as kindness. But Jonathan followed her into the hallway. "You don't like me being involved," he said, not unkindly. "I don't like distractions," she replied, not stopping. "Do I distract you?" She turned, slowly, her voice firm. "You're used to being the center of attention. I'm used to avoiding it. So yes, you're a distraction." Jonathan nodded, taking the hit without protest. "Understood." She started walking again, but then quietly, he added, "You're not what I expected." Helen paused mid-step. Then, without looking back, she said, "Good." The next few days unfolded in an odd, almost rhythmical discomfort. They didn't talk unless necessary, and yet they noticed. Jonathan noticed the way Helen would hum, barely audibly, when she was sketching in the corner of a meeting room. Helen noticed how Jonathan always sat near the window, as if needing light to think. He always carried a real pen, not digital. She always drew by hand before transferring to software. They were both deliberate, controlled, but underneath it all, a slow awareness grew. They were watching each other, not like adversaries, like two people waiting for the other to say what neither dared to. Late one afternoon, a storm rolled into the city. The rain came fast, slapping the windows of the planning office. The team was long gone. Helen remained, reviewing elevation charts in silence. She didn't realize Jonathan was still there until she heard the shift of a chair behind her. "You're still working?" he asked, voice softer than usual. "I'm always working." He stepped closer, hands in his pockets. "Do you ever stop?" Helen didn't answer, but the question hung in the air like the thunder outside. He leaned against the doorway, watching her, not with challenge, but with something gentler. "I wasn't expecting you to be this hard to impress," he admitted. Helen looked up, expression unreadable. "That's because I'm not here to be impressed." By the end of the week, everyone noticed. They didn't speak much, not outside of meetings, not in front of others. But there was something undeniable in the air whenever they were in the same room. It wasn't romantic. Not exactly. It was the kind of tension that made people slow down their conversations, lean in, or lower their voices, as if afraid of missing something unsaid. On Friday afternoon, the team gathered for an on-site walkthrough of the park grounds. The storm earlier in the week had left the soil damp and the trees heavy with lingering drops. The air was thick and quiet, like the world was listening in. Helen arrived in her usual way, hair tied back, clipboard in hand, boots slightly worn from use, not fashion. Jonathan arrived later, in rolled-up sleeves and a calm composure that didn't fit the mud underfoot. They didn't greet each other. They didn't need to. As the city's engineering rep talked through drainage strategy, Helen crouched near the base of a young oak tree, brushing her fingers along the moss that clung to the roots. Jonathan watched her. The others didn't notice, but he did. He noticed how she touched the earth like it had a heartbeat. Later, when the others moved ahead to inspect the perimeter fence, Jonathan lingered back. Helen was still near the tree, drawing notes in her sketchbook with a deliberate hand. "Is that where the bench goes?" he asked, pointing to the clearing she was marking. She looked up, nodding. "Shade at 3 p.m. Best angle for afternoon light." Jonathan stepped closer, but not too close. He didn't want to disrupt the quiet she carried. "You think about things most people overlook. I design for people who are usually overlooked," she said simply. Jonathan smiled, not mocking, just soft. "That's what I meant." Helen stood. She met his gaze for a moment too long, then turned to pack her things. But before she walked away, she asked, without facing him, "Why are you still here, Jonathan?" He blinked. "You mean, today I mean in this project. You could delegate. You're a man who signs things, not builds them." Jonathan hesitated, then answered with more honesty than he intended, "Because this is the first time I've wanted to stay close to something that feels honest." Helen's breath caught, but only slightly. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. because her silence, as always, said enough. That evening, they were the last two at the office. Again, unplanned. The rain had started again, soft at first, then heavier, tapping against the large windows of the planning floor like fingertips on glass. Helen sat alone in the small break room, sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped mug, the kind no one claimed, and she liked it that way. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "I figured you'd be here," he said. "I figured you'd be gone." He shrugged. "Maybe I like the sound of rain on windows." Helen glanced at him. "Or maybe you just can't sit still unless you're around something that challenges you." He chuckled softly, stepping inside. "That's fair." They stood there in silence for a long moment, rain filling the space where words weren't needed. Then, softly, he asked, "Do you ever get tired of holding yourself so tightly together?" Helen looked down at her tea, then at the rain. "Every day," she said, "but it's safer than falling apart." Jonathan didn't speak again, but something in him shifted. He wanted to reach for her, not to fix her, not to change her, just to let her know she didn't have to hold it all alone. But he didn't, because timing, for once, felt more important than courage. As he turned to leave, Helen said one last thing, almost a whisper. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Jonathan paused, his back still to her, and answered just as softly, "I'm trying not to." Rumors don't need wings to fly. By Monday morning, whispers had already found their way through the narrow hallways and shared drives of the planning department. It started with a glance just when someone swore they saw between Helen and Jonathan in the break room. Then came the theories. He doesn't usually stay that late. Unless he has a reason. She's been quieter lately, which says a lot, considering it's her. I heard he personally reviewed her proposals. That's never happened before. Helen knew. Of course. She knew. She felt it in the shift of tone when people greeted her, in the sideways glances during meetings, in how even the most well-meaning colleagues began their questions with careful neutrality. And yet, she said nothing. Because in her world, speaking was riskier than silence. Jonathan noticed the shift too, but in a different way. He was used to being speculated about by investors, by journalists, by people who only saw his suit, not the man beneath it. But this was different. This was personal. He didn't like the way Helen's name now lingered in conversations longer than it should. He didn't like that his presence might make her feel exposed. But most of all, he didn't like the idea that staying close to her might be causing her harm. That afternoon, Helen requested a private meeting with him. It wasn't scheduled. She walked into his office with a steady step, closed the door quietly behind her, and stood without sitting. "I need to know something," she said. Jonathan looked up from his desk, reading her instantly. "Ask, are you using me?" she asked, tone even. "To feel something, to chase something. I don't care what. I just want to know the truth." Jonathan stood, slowly. "No," he said. "I'm not using you." "Then why are you here?" she asked, voice tight. "Why do you look at me like I'm supposed to be more than just another line in your calendar?" He took a step closer, then stopped. "Because," he said, quietly, "I don't want to watch you from a distance and wonder who you are. I want to know, even if you won't let me." Helen's face didn't move, but something in her shoulders dropped. "You shouldn't be saying things like that," she whispered. "Not here. Not now. I know. And I can't pretend this isn't affecting my work. That's not who I am. I know that, too." She looked away, jaw tight. For someone so careful. "Jonathan, you're being incredibly reckless." He gave a quiet smile, almost sad. "Maybe that's because being near you is the only time I feel honest." The next day, Helen buried herself in number spreadsheets, structural charts, cost analysis documents, anything that required logic, not feeling. She didn't speak more than necessary. She skipped lunch, she stayed late, she convinced herself it was professionalism, but deep down, She knew it was avoidance. On Wednesday, during a site meeting with city officials and neighborhood leaders, Helen stood in front of the renderings, presenting proposed adjustments to the walking paths and seating layouts. She was calm, precise, clear. But halfway through the meeting, as she flipped to the next slide, she felt his presence, Jonathan, standing just outside the circle of chairs, listening silently. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Her voice didn't waver, but her heartbeat did. That evening, she stayed behind after everyone left. Alone in the design room, she paced. The air was thick with fluorescent hum and the scent of old markers and paper. She needed to clear her head. She needed space. But just as she reached for her coat, she heard his voice behind her. "You're avoiding me." She turned slowly. "I'm trying to work." He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "Work isn't the problem, Helen. It's what happens when we stop." She crossed her arms. "And what happens, Jonathan?" He didn't answer right away, just looked at her, long, steady. "You already know," he said. Helen's voice cracked, just slightly. "This is a bad idea." "Maybe," he said. "But what if it's the first real one I've had in years?" Silence fell between them. Not awkward, just too full. Too full of things that had no place in work emails or progress reports. Too full of every look, every unfinished sentence, every moment their hands almost touched and didn't. Helen took a step back. "I can't afford this. Not here, not like this." Jonathan nodded. "Then tell me what you can afford." She didn't have an answer, so she walked past him, slowly, carefully. But just before she reached the door, he said, "Don't mistake silence for safety. Helen, you're allowed to want something more than just control." She paused, didn't turn, didn't reply, just walked out. And for the first time since they met, neither of them felt like they had the upper hand. The cafe was tucked away on a quiet corner of East Monroe Street, small, dimly lit, and always half empty after 7 p.m. Helen liked it for that very reason. No music too loud, no servers interrupting every 10 minutes, no one looking for a reason to talk, just her, a notebook, and the hum of life at a distance. So, when Jonathan Reed walked in and spotted her in the back booth alone, half buried in building notes and tea-stained sketches, he hesitated. He could have turned and left, should have, maybe, but he didn't. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, like every step was a decision. Helen looked up as he approached, not surprised, but not entirely welcoming either. "I didn't know you came here," she said, eyes cool but voice even. "I didn't," he replied. "Until now." She gestured to the seat across from her without a word. He sat, no menu, no pretense, just the quiet between them and the steam rising from her untouched tea. For a while, neither spoke. Then Jonathan leaned forward, folding his hands like a man about to testify in court. "I used to think I was good at relationships," he said. Helen raised an eyebrow. "You," he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I was engaged, years ago. We lived together for 2 years, traveled, hosted dinner parties, took couples photos on mountaintops. From the outside, it looked functional, ideal, even. What happened? She left, said she didn't know me, said I didn't let her in." Helen nodded, more to herself than to him. "She was right," he added. Helen looked down at her cup, tracing the rim with one finger. "Do you think people really want to know the parts we don't show?" she asked. "Or do they just want us to bleed for them so they feel closer?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. "Then I think we all just want someone to stay when we finally stop pretending." Helen didn't reply, because maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what she feared the most. Outside, the rain had started again, light this time, barely brushing the windows, like a memory trying to come back. Jonathan looked at her, his voice quieter now. "Why are you alone so often?" Helen gave a half shrug. "I trust silence more than I trust people. That's not the same as being at peace." "No," she agreed. But it's safer. Jonathan leaned back. I've spent my life building walls, he said. It took me years to realize they were just mirrors. I wasn't protecting myself, I was watching myself disappear. Helen's breath caught at that. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't romantic. It was just true. And truth, when spoken gently, could be devastating. The server came and went without speaking, leaving a second cup of tea on the table. Jonathan didn't touch it. Helen did. Then, almost without looking at him, she said, "You don't scare me." Jonathan, not the wealth, not the reputation, not the way people look at you when you walk into a room. He tilted his head, surprised. "What does scare you then?" She looked up, steady. "How easily you see through me." A beat of silence. And then, as if it were the only thing he could say, "I don't see through you, Helen. I see with you." They didn't talk much after that, but they didn't leave, either. They just sat. Two people on the edge of something neither of them had words for yet. Later that night, Helen lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling like it held answers she hadn't asked for. Jonathan's words echoed in her mind. Not loud, just persistent. "I see with you." She thought about that. What would it mean to let someone see with her? Not just her work, not just her silence, but her entirely. It was too soon, too close, too possible. Jonathan, in his own apartment across the city, stood barefoot in the kitchen, sipping a glass of water like it might calm the restlessness in his chest. He had never spoken like that to anyone, not even to himself. And yet, with her, everything came out simple, not easy. But simple, because Helen didn't ask for anything, and that made him want to give her everything. The city was quiet that night. A rare stillness had settled over Austin. No sirens, no restless traffic, just the hush of late September air moving through the streets like a secret. Helen stood outside Jonathan's apartment building, staring up at the 9th floor window where a single light still glowed. She hadn't meant to come. She told herself it was about the project, that she had a late update on the final budget revisions, that it was easier to discuss things in person than to email back and forth all weekend. But deep down, she knew. It wasn't about logistics. It was about him. And the way his voice had sounded the last time they spoke, not urgent, not pleading, but open, unguarded. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. Jonathan opened the door without hesitation, like he'd been expecting her. Maybe he had. He didn't ask why she was there. He just stepped aside and said softly, "Come in." Helen entered slowly, taking in the understated elegance of the space-clean lines, dark wood, soft lighting, no personal photos, just books, carefully placed artwork, and a view of the city that seemed both vast and impossibly lonely. He offered her tea. She nodded. Neither of them said much as they moved through the motions boiling water, pouring into ceramic mugs, standing side by side in the quiet of his kitchen. It was the most domestic thing she'd done in months, and it felt strange and safe. They sat on opposite ends of the sofa, tea in hand, shoulders tense. Then Jonathan broke the silence. "You didn't have to come all the way here just to talk about numbers." Helen didn't look at him. "I know. Then why did you, pause?" "Then, because I didn't want the quiet between us to turn into distance." That made Jonathan inhale slowly. "I've spent most of my life confusing silence with safety," he said. "But lately, I'm starting to think silence is just where fear hides." Helen turned to face him. "That's what scares me, that I've built a life so quiet, I don't even know how to let someone in anymore." Jonathan leaned forward, setting his mug down. "You let me in, Helen. Whether you meant to or not." She looked at him, and for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid settled between them like gravity. The moment hung there, fragile and full. He didn't reach for her. He didn't move closer, and maybe that's why she did. Helen set her tea aside and shifted, slowly, toward the center of the couch. Jonathan mirrored her. Their hands didn't touch, but they were close, resting on the same cushion, fingers barely apart. When he finally spoke, His voice was barely a whisper. "You can stay. Just tonight. No expectations. No lines crossed. Just be here." Helen's heart thudded once loud enough for her to feel in her throat. The thought of staying, of allowing herself to just be with him, was terrifying. Not because she didn't want to, but because she did. She nodded. And so, they stayed, not in bed, not entangled in sheets and promises, just there, on that couch. Two people sitting in the middle of a life neither of them knew how to name. They talked, softly, slowly, about nothing and about everything. About his childhood habit of memorizing constellations, about her mother's Alzheimer's and how the disease took her piece by piece, about how neither of them had cried in years until recently. At some point, Helen leaned her head against his shoulder, not from romance, but from quiet exhaustion. Jonathan didn't move. He just let her rest. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, it felt like enough. But just before sunrise, Helen stirred. She stood without waking him, gathered her things, and tiptoed toward the door. She left a note on the counter. 4 words. "Don't wait for me." She didn't mean it as rejection. She meant it as protection, because the kind of closeness they'd just shared wordless. Sacred was the kind that could shatter a person if it disappeared, and she wasn't sure either of them could afford that right now. When Jonathan woke, the apartment was too quiet. He found the note almost immediately, read it once, then again, and then he smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she had stayed almost, and almost meant something was changing, for both of them. The Monday after Helen left Jonathan's apartment before dawn, the air between them changed, not dramatically, not with sharp words or avoidance, but with something subtler, something harder to name. They weren't strangers, but they weren't anything else, either. Just two people with memories they weren't ready to carry together. At the office, Helen buried herself in logistics, revisions, permits, community requests. She spent hours fine-tuning the Greenway's final plan, recalculating bench placements and shade structures as if they were barriers strong enough to hold her emotions in place. Her team noticed. They didn't ask questions, but they didn't smile as often, either. Jonathan was no different. He arrived on time, left on time, spoke only when required, no late-night texts, no unannounced drop-ins at the design floor, no sideways glances across the conference table. He gave her space, but in doing so, he gave himself a silence he didn't know how to live in. They ran into each other literally 3 days later. Helen had just stepped out of a meeting room, arms full of renderings and city review notes. Jonathan had been walking down the hall with Greg, mid-conversation. When they turned the corner, papers flew, blueprints scattered, clipboards clattered, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then Helen crouched quickly, gathering documents, avoiding his gaze. "I've got it," she said. Jonathan hesitated. I said I've got it." He nodded, stepped back, watched her straighten the pages with surgical precision, like controlling the mess on the floor would make the one inside her easier to manage. Greg cleared his throat and awkwardly excused himself. Jonathan stayed. When Helen finally stood up, arms full, she paused. Their eyes met, for the first time in days. "You don't have to fix this," she said quietly. "I'm not trying to." "Then what are you doing?" Jonathan looked down, then back at her, trying not to lose you. Helen swallowed hard. "You never had me." A beat of silence. Then she added, more softly, "And maybe that's the problem. Maybe neither of us knows what it means to be had." The next day, Helen requested reassignment. A quiet note sent through internal email. No drama, no explanation. Just a simple request to be transferred to the adjacent city project downtown, an affordable housing initiative in early design phase. When the notice landed on Jonathan's desk, he stared at it for 10 minutes, not reading, just holding it. Like the paper itself might answer the question pounding in his chest, did I push her too far? Or not far enough? That evening, he showed up at the park site unannounced. Helen was there, Of course, she always was, kneeling by the edge of the playground layout, making chalk marks on the concrete for future placement. When she looked up and saw him, her body stilled, but her hand didn't. She kept drawing. He didn't speak right away, just walked closer. "You're leaving the project," he said. She nodded once. I thought maybe it'd be easier. For who, she hesitated. Then stood, wiped her hands on her jeans. For everyone. Jonathan stepped forward. "I never wanted to complicate your work, Helen, and yet you did. I know." There was a pause. Then Helen's voice calm, low, steady. "You make me feel things I can't file away, and I've lived my life in carefully labeled boxes. You don't fit into any of them." Jonathan exhaled, a quiet surrender. "I never wanted to be a label. You're not, but you're a variable I don't know how to manage." The clouds rolled in slowly overhead, casting a gray hush over the park in progress. Jonathan looked around at the raw dirt, the half-built pathways, the skeletal outlines of something meant to bring peace to a city always in motion. Then he looked at her. "You don't have to manage me, Helen. I don't need fixing. I just need space in your world." She shook her head. "It's not about space. It's about timing. And right now, I'm still trying to learn how to stay when everything in me wants to run." Jonathan didn't ask her to stay, didn't beg, didn't reach. He just nodded, then quietly said, "Then when you're ready to stop running, I'll still be here," and walked away. That night, Helen sat in her apartment, staring at her laptop's glowing screen. The transfer form still sat in her inbox, unsubmitted. Jonathan never made unannounced visits. His life had been built on schedules, strict ones, minutes measured, meetings managed, emotions locked behind efficiency. But on that gray Saturday morning, he stood alone in front of the Cedar Haven Memory Care Center, holding nothing but a single stem of white iris and an invisible ache he hadn't named yet. He had no idea what he was doing there. Only that Helen had once whispered something about this place, and about a woman inside it who remembered less of her each day. The front desk nurse smiled, a little surprised to see a man like him, pressed coat, polished shoes, eyes too tired for a weekend. "Are you family?" she asked kindly. Jonathan hesitated. "Not exactly," he said, "but I'm someone she once trusted." They led him to the courtyard, quiet, sun-dappled, a few sparrows hopping between scattered leaves, and there she was, Helen Ward, sitting alone in a rocking chair, blanket across her knees, humming something tuneless to the air. Jonathan approached slowly. He didn't speak, just lowered himself onto the bench nearby. Evelyn didn't acknowledge him at first, but after a moment, she looked over. "You're new," she said, eyes sharp despite the fog behind them. "Yes, ma'am," he said gently. "You're not here for me," she continued. "You're here for her." Jonathan blinked. "Excuse me." The older woman chuckled softly. "Helen, you've got that look, like you've been carrying something with her name on it." He felt something twist in his chest. Evelyn reached for the iris without asking, held it like it was something rare. "She used to bring me flowers every Thursday," she said. "Never told me why, just did." Jonathan watched her, unsure whether she remembered him or if she was simply wise in ways time could not erase. "She's a good woman," Evelyn said softly. "Too good at disappearing when she's scared." Jonathan's throat tightened. "I think I made it worse," he admitted. Evelyn looked at him, clear, grounded. "Then make it better." Later that day, Helen arrived at the care center with her usual quiet presence, a small tote bag of lavender-scented lotion, soft knit socks, and a book of poetry Evelyn used to read in her 30s. But the nurse stopped her at the door. "She had a visitor today," she said. Helen froze. "Who?" The nurse smiled, didn't give a name. Tall man, kind eyes. Left after an hour or so, but he brought her flowers. Helen's pulse skipped, a white iris. That evening, she sat in her car for a long time before heading home. The thought of Jonathan sitting with her mother, gentle, present, silent, felt heavier than any love letter. Because that kind of care had no performance. It was quiet, intentional, brave. It was real. And Helen didn't know what to do with something that real. At 9:37 p.m., she stood outside his apartment again. No folder, no excuse, just her. She knocked. Twice. Jonathan opened the door slowly. He didn't look surprised, just calm, like he'd been hoping, not expecting. She stepped inside before he could ask. "I heard you visited her," she said. "I did." Helen nodded. "Why?" He looked at her, quiet for a beat, then answered, "Because I wanted to see the part of you that still loved, even when it hurt." Helen looked away. "You shouldn't have done that. I didn't go for approval," he said. "I went because you let me close enough to care." She inhaled sharply. "I never asked for that." "No," Jonathan replied, "but maybe that's the problem." She turned from him, voice brittle. "I don't know how to need someone without fearing I'll lose them." Jonathan stepped closer, but didn't touch her. "I'm not promising forever," he said. "I'm just asking for now, and honesty." Helen closed her eyes, and for the first time, let herself say the thing she had never said out loud. "I'm terrified of what of being seen, and not being enough." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "Then let me be the one who stays. Not because you're perfect, but because you're not." Silence fell, but this time, it wasn't distance. It was depth, and in that space, something shifted. A truth long buried had surfaced. Not everything was resolved, not every fear silenced, but the wall, at long last, had cracked. Helen hadn't seen Jonathan in 4 days, not at the site, not in meetings, not in the planning reports or board memos. It was as if he'd vanished. And somehow, that absence echoed louder than his presence ever had. At first, she told herself not to read into it. He was a CEO. He had meetings, flights, obligations. Maybe he was traveling. Maybe he was letting her breathe. But then, whispers started circling through the department. Whispers that made her stop mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-heartbeat. "Did you hear Reed pulled his funding from the Westline Tower redevelopment? Walked away from $20 million in projected return. Apparently, it conflicted with city resources for Greenway." Helen stood in the hallway, frozen, files in hand. She didn't need the rest of the gossip. She understood exactly what it meant. The Westline project had been a luxury expansion, projected to gentrify and absorb land along the edges of the city edges, where community spaces were thinning, where Helen had been quietly fighting to protect shared public land. She had spoken about it during a meeting weeks ago, barely raising her voice, but clearly opposing its encroachment near the Greenway plan. And now, it was gone, pulled, silently, by Jonathan Reed. That evening, Helen showed up at his office, not the planning site, not his apartment, the office, top floor, steel and glass, and the sound of a secretary typing 2 desks away. She didn't wait to be buzzed in. She opened the door. Jonathan was at his desk, sleeves rolled up, tie on the chair behind him, reading something with that familiar furrow between his brows. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't smile. He just stood, slowly, quietly. "You pulled Westline," she said. "I did." Why, Jonathan's voice was low, even because it threatened something more important. Helen stared at him. "Me." "No." He said, "Us." She took a step forward. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know. I never wanted your money to become a way to control you." He finished. "Neither did I." Helen's voice sharpened. Then why Jonathan stepped out from behind the desk, close enough for her to see the tired beneath his eyes. "Because I've made a lot of decisions in my life that served the man I thought I had to be. This one," he pointed toward the window, the skyline, the streets below. "This one was for the man I want to be." Helen's breath caught. She wasn't used to grand gestures, and this wasn't flowers or gifts. This was sacrifice, influence, integrity, and it terrified her. "I don't know how to be in something that isn't guarded," she said. Jonathan gave a small, sad smile. "And I don't know how to love in pieces." She looked away, then back. "Don't make me the reason you change your life." He stepped closer. You're not the reason. You're the reminder. She didn't speak, because her heart was louder than her mouth now, pounding, softening, opening, and she wasn't ready, but she was close, closer than ever. He took her hand gently. I'm not asking for anything, he said. Not today. Not tomorrow. Pause. But when you're ready to stop living like the ground will fall out from beneath you, I want to be the one who stands beside you. Helen swallowed hard. Tears didn't come, but something inside her cracked just enough for the light to get in. I don't know if I'll be enough, she whispered. Jonathan squeezed her hand. You already are. Later, when Helen stepped out into the night air, she didn't feel like she was leaving anything behind. She felt like she was walking towards something. Not a promise, not a guarantee, but something she had spent her whole life pretending she didn't need belonging. No ribbon cutting, no press conference, just a quiet Sunday morning, sunlight folding through the leaves like something holy. Helen stood by the playground she once mapped on paper, now surrounded by laughing children, tired parents, and slow-walking elders, tracing the new stone paths she had laid down with care. It was everything she had hoped it would be, not spectacular, but steady, lived in, real. She hadn't seen Jonathan since that night in his office. There had been no dramatic goodbye, no definitive next step, just space. And in that space, something unspoken had grown stronger, not weaker. Across the park, under a newly planted magnolia tree, Helen stood with a clipboard, watching a maintenance crew install a mosaic plaque she had designed a dedication to public memory and community. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her at first, but she felt them, the same way she had felt his presence long before he ever said her name. Did you get the bench where you wanted it? Jonathan's voice came, low and warm. Helen turned. There he was, not in a suit, not in business armor, just jeans, a shirt with sleeves rolled, hair wind-tossed. Barely, she said. The city pushed back until I gave them a revised shade analysis with 3 years of growth projections. He smiled, still fighting for the quiet details. Someone has to, she replied. They stood there, the late morning sun filtering through branches above them, casting shifting patterns on the ground. It felt like nothing had changed, and like everything had. Jonathan looked at the mosaic tile in the ground. It was simple, earth-toned, carved with one sentence. This space belongs to the ones who stay when it's hard. He looked back at her. That's yours. No, she said. It's everyone's. He nodded, letting the meaning linger. Then I heard you started teaching again. Helen tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. A community art class. Just once a week. For kids. She smiled. For whoever shows up. A little girl nearby dropped her crayon and began to cry, small, crumpled sobs of a child overwhelmed by a world too big. Before Helen could step forward, Jonathan moved first. He crouched down beside her, picked up the crayon gently, and handed it back. No words, just kindness. The child nodded and sniffled, then ran off. Helen watched from a few feet away, her chest tightening not in pain, but in recognition. This was the version of him no one saw, the one she had always believed was there. After a while, he walked back to her. I didn't come today to disrupt, he said. I came to see if your world still had space for me. Helen looked at him, long, steady. And then, finally, without pretense or pause, it never stopped having space for you. I just needed time to believe I deserved to fill it. Jonathan didn't reach for her hand. He didn't need to, because her voice had already closed the distance. They sat together on the bench beneath the magnolia tree, watching the park come alive in the simplest of ways. No confessions, no titles, no final act, just the soft, certain rhythm of two people choosing to be present, and maybe, after everything, that was love. Not the loud kind, not the cinematic kind, but the kind that stayed quiet, true. There. Some stories don't end with fireworks. They end with someone choosing to stay when it's hard, when it's quiet, and when the world tells them to walk away. Helen and Jonathan taught us something precious, that love doesn't always arrive loud, polished, or perfectly timed. Sometimes it arrives messy, soft, but when it's real, it changes everything. This is also a reminder in a world that often measures worth by power, wealth, or status, to never overlook the ones who choose kindness over charisma, who speak through action, not applause. Because seeing someone for who they are beyond titles, beyond appearances, is the most radical act of love and equality. So let's honor the Helens of the world, the quiet warriors, the gentle fighters, and call out any system, belief, or voice that says they are less than because they don't shine the loudest. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone you cherish, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Your support helps us bring more voices, more truths, and more healing into the world. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and keep your heart open.